this is, I think, probably the most difficult question that we're going to be faced with. And people think right now at the moment that it's a pandemic and should be worried about epidemics and so forth, and worried about how we're going to get out of COVID. But in fact, the looming crisis, a much more important one, I think, even than COVID, is going to be the environmental crisis. And there, the problem is that we're doing exactly the same thing as we try to do in theoretical economics. We look for the optimal choice. What choice should we make in terms of how much emissions we actually produce? What choice should we make optimally to balance the loss that we're going to have in growth with the gain that we could get in reducing carbon emissions? And that's really the wrong way to look at it, because the argument there is, well, could we find some sort of nice equilibrium with the planet a bit warmer, because after all, we have been producing a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, but could we just not, for example, look at what would be the optimal temperature? Maybe you could have a temperature increase of, let's say, 2 degrees, 3 degrees. We're now aiming at 2 or even less, but we're more likely to be headed for 4. And the problem is that all these calculations about optima suggest that when you get to 4 degrees warming, that's where you're going to stay. And then we can work out how you organize that and how you change things, how some parts of the planet will become very dry and too hot. Look at Australia, for example. And then we're going to work out how we're going to handle that and work out the cost of that and compare it with what should we be doing to change that. And that's a completely wrong way to look at it, for the simple reason that we're in this evolving, changing system. We're not in a system where you can decide on 4 degrees, get up the emissions right to stay at 4 degrees. You won't stay at 4 degrees. If you get to 4 degrees warmer, it will get even warmer. And that's the real disaster, is that we're not dealing with it in the right way. We're not reacting to this system as it evolves. And we see these things accelerating. We watch the Antarctic ice melting, and we see all of these things happening, and we are doing it. And this is the important thing. The Anthropocene era, the one that we now live in, is one in which we have done a great deal to change the environment and the constraints that we live under. So we have to do something about that. And I think the only realistic way is to look at what we can actually do now quickly to ensure that in the longer run, our children and even ourselves, well, probably not me, but will be in a satisfactory, reasonable situation. And people keep trying to calculate the cost. This is what happened. Nordhaus got the economics, the prize, the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on the environment. But I really think that the person who should have got it was Nick Stern, who sounded the alarm and pointed out that making the sort of calculations I've just been talking about doesn't actually solve the problem. We don't want to calculate the costs and so forth. I think the cost of changing is grossly overestimated. And indeed, the benefits that we get, it's not as if we're doing something for which our children will have to pay. No, if your children are faced with a world in which the water is cleaner, in which the environment is better, and where the world is no longer sort of sizzling and starting to burn, they will be very grateful. They won't think, well, good heavens, why did our parents ever do that? And how are we going to reimburse this debt? That's not the right way to think about it. We should just be doing all that we can right now to change the system so that we can actually not depend on things which are totally out of our control in some sense. So the point is that should we sort of calculate these costs and benefits as we're doing, given that the world as it is organized to depend on taking stuff out of the ground, burning it, and then suffering the consequences, and then trying to do something about it. I mean, the radical solution is one which Doyne Farmer at Oxford has proposed. He said, let's decide to leave it all in the ground. Let's just leave it in the ground and then try and work with that. Of course, nobody would accept that, particularly the powerful fossil fuel lobby. But in some sense, that is what we should be aiming for. And if you just took a quick moment in the COVID crisis, there was that wonderful moment where satellite photographs of emissions in Beijing and in northern Italy showed that suddenly areas which were heavily polluted became clear, became green. And that was simply because we stopped doing what we usually do, which is burning the fossil fuels, which we then use to produce things. And probably a lot of things that we don't actually really either need or want. So I think that the whole approach to choosing an optimum trade-off between two things is not the right one. We should simply recognize that there is this tendency now for the climate to not only to warm, but also to accelerate. And the other problem is we don't really know, even with the best climate models, exactly what the consequences will be. We've started to see them. We see them in Australia. We see them in the changing time at which even when you're just gathering the grapes for wine. When I first moved to France, that happened in September. Now it happens at the end of August. And so the climate is changing, and we have to adapt ourselves and do all that we can to prevent this becoming a sort of spiral into a disaster. So I think that this is something where we have to look at the world in a very different way. It's not a world which is in a nice equilibrium, gets knocked off a bit by shocks and so forth. It's a world in which everything is changing, everything is evolving, everything is adapting. And we just have to learn how to deal with that in a much more pragmatic and much more modest way, but in a much more purposeful way.